The easiest raid bosses, wouldn't that just be the first raid boss of every raid since it's always the easiest? Well, for a lot of raids after the Burning Crusade, that's generally true. But I'm going to cut some slack to most first boss encounters and only mention standout ones. And the bosses will be ranked with all possible difficulties in mind and not just normal mode. So, what even constitutes an easy raid fight? Well, one with few mechanics, or just very easy mechanics that even that one person raid with zero raid awareness who's only in the raid because he's friends with one of the officer who dies at almost every pool could do. Well, after a few tries at least. At number 10, we'll have the only first boss on the list, the Flame Leviathan. Flame Leviathan is one of the few fights in WoW to just put everyone into a vehicle and abandon class roles. No tanks, healers, or DPS, just one of 3 vehicles needed to kill the boss who constantly just changes targets. The fight itself was pretty easy. Interrupt an ability, kite, and attack. Very few guilds ever had trouble downing him on normal mode, but the hard mode version was quite challenging. The fight took place in the raid tier before Blizzard introduced heroic and normal mode versions of fights, but there were ways to do bosses in Old WoW to make them basically be heroic mode and reward better gear. Next up on the list, we have the bosses from VOA and Baradin Hold. These 2 raids were made to be pugged, so none of the bosses were all that difficult. In order to even fight the bosses in either raid, your faction had to control Wintergrass for VOA or Tolbarad for Baradin Hold. A new boss for each raid was released with each new major content patch, progressively getting harder than the previous bosses and dropping better loot. But even then, like I said, these bosses were created with the intention of being pugged, so any organized raid group with half a brain who went in and attempted them got kills. People would usually compare how easy a boss was by comparing it to one from these 2 raids. Like, for example, Flame Leviathan was considered easier than the last boss to be released in VOA. Toravon the Ice Watcher, whose only major mechanic relied on your ranged DPS actually switching to the ads that spawned. Number 8, the Twin Consorts and Throne of Thunder. Now, usually in raids, the second to last boss is supposed to be the second hardest fight in the raid, and sometimes it's even the hardest, like with the case of Spine of Deathwing and Dragon Soul. But Twin Consorts, I guess, are one of the rare exceptions to the rule. Now, they aren't the easiest fight in Throne of Thunder, but I'm excluding first bosses from the rest of this list. As long as one person in the raid knows how to do the constellation patterns gimmick of the fight, everything else is just pretty straightforward. I remember, back in the days of Throne of Thunder, our guild had finally downed Iron Khan, the boss before Consorts after a long night of raiding, who was a pretty difficult fight. Then, seeing as we had about 10 minutes before the raid was over, we thought we might as well take a look at the next fight before looking at the strategy and explaining the fight to everyone. We had our warrior DPS volunteer to do the constellations because he saw a video on how to do it and was excited to try it out, so we went for it. And to this day, this is the only time I've ever downed a non-first boss of a raid on my first attempt. Its heroic mode wasn't that much harder either. Number 7, the Loot Reaver in Tempest Keep. This fight was pretty straightforward. Move away from the arcane orbs that silence everyone hit. And that's pretty much it. It's basically a tank and spank fight with casters having to run away from orbs every now and again. Oh, and he's immune to poisons, so it sucked to be a rogue or hunter. He was also immune to a whole bunch of other random spells like Drain Life and Mana Tap, since bosses used to be immune to things like that back in the day. Number 6, Akama in Black Temple. This fight was famous for people accidentally starting the fight before the trash in the room was cleared out, more than the actual fight itself. You see, the boss was basically kill ads to stop ads from spawning, then DPS down the big guy who's a cakewalk and collect loot. Such a fitting fight to such an important lore character. Number 5, the Butcher in highmaul. Normal mode is basically a tank and spank. You stand there and DPS them down. This fight is more about numbers than anything. Once your gear is good, the fight gets easier. But it was kinda designed that way. Still, that doesn't make it any less easier. The Mythic mode was basically the same thing, only with an added ad mechanic that required your raid to huddle in a corner. Number 4, Ultraxzion and Dragon Soul. Another numbers fight, except you literally just stand still the whole fight. At least with Butcher, you got knocked back every minute or so, but Ultraxzion was pretty interesting fight nonetheless. Even though you stood still the whole fight, you did sometimes have to push the extra action button to avoid the raid wipe mechanic that he threw out every once in a while. Also, healers and tanks got some really neat buffs for the fight that really allowed you to pump out some crazy healing numbers. Number 3, the Karazhan chess event. The chess event is a unique fight in the same vein as Flame Leviathan, in that it doesn't actually require tanks, healers, or DPS, just players controlling chess pieces. The game itself is kinda like chess, but your pieces can auto-attack and use special abilities. Plus, medieval cheat sometimes and throw fire under some of your pieces, since they don't die from chest rules and instead die from their health drops to 0. All you have to do is kill the enemy king and you win. It's a weird fight, but was very easy in its day, and is well known now as a hard fight to solo since the pieces don't scale off gear like the siege engines do in Flame Leviathan. Number 2. Patchwerk in Wrath Nax, the original tank and spank. His mechanics include Hateful Strike and a shortened range timer. He was basically a walking target dummy. Players could go balls to the walls to see how much DPS they could put out on a real boss while standing still. The tanks also took a lot of damage, so healers were spamming like crazy as well. There was a bit of a rumor of how to properly handle the Hateful Strike mechanic, the one and only mechanic of the fight, which has the text of, Patchwerk will use this ability every 1 second, hitting the person with the highest health in melee range. This caused some raids to tank him next to the slime pools and have the melee players dip in and out to make sure they were not at full health, so they wouldn't be instant killed. But what actually happened was that Patchwerk would only choose 1 or 2, or 3 on 25 men, people with the highest threat to attack, and ignore the others. Patchwerk is the cornerstone of comparing easy bosses to, and would be number 1 on this list, if not for one other boss fight that was so easy it makes Patchwerk look like Yogg Zero in comparison.
Alliance Gunship! All hands on deck!
Number 1. The Gunship Battle in ICC. I remember doing this fight on Heroic before ever doing it on Normal. This is arguably the easiest fight ever put into the game, even comparing it to all the other first bosses and the bosses from this list. The fight was a glorified ad fight that required players to hop in cannons and shoot down the enemy ship. While it did have a lot of mechanics compared to the other fights on this list, all of them were extremely easy to handle. Ranged players would shoot down the archers on the enemy boat, melee would kill adds on your boat. When the enemy mage froze your cannons, you had your tank jump over to their side to tank their boss who didn't need to be killed. Just kept busy, while the other DPS who jumped over with you killed the mage to get back to shooting the boat with the cannons. There was also some void zones to move out of that were dangerous on Heroic, but that fight was largely the same. Unlike the tank and spank fights on this list, this one was both easy and didn't really require amazing gear. Everyone and their mom could down loot ship on Heroic. In fact, people would sell carries on Lich King just so players could have the option to do gunship on Heroic with their raid groups, since you had to have down the last boss of the raid in order to have the option of switching the difficulty. ICC had both the easiest boss fight in the game, and one of the hardest in the form of Heroic Lich King. And that's it for this video. You may have noticed I didn't mention any vanilla raid bosses, and that's because raiding was still new, and everyone was still new to the game, so most bosses may have been mechanically easy, but hard for their time, so I cut them some slack.